act, and it's of course all about action. We want to listen again to 3 speakers who are presenting something in brief, and then we have a little debate with them after that. Issues for this last part on ACT can be do the approaches and the instruments and the projects and so on we heard about, do they really help and in which way? What do we now need to make them happen? Do we need even more innovations, or is it rather to implement those which are on the table? And of course the big issue on the finances, which Michael already had touched earlier. So we are having 3 colleagues to be with us here. Michael Schneider, Irena Spazzapan, I hope that's right, and Dries Acke. But we said that they rather can sit here because there are some presentations and it's more nicer if you listen to them from here. But Michael, please come, you can start. I don't know, you don't have a presentation, I think? You have one? Okay.
More pictures then.
Okay.
Well, I'll start it.
Yeah.
And any of the microphones and also...
So, you were on the floor already.
Yes.
But you are not going to repeat, I'm sure, but you are telling us more about from solar roof tiles and carbon-free district heating in Europe to energy systems in Africa. So we are adding the component of, I understand, motivation, acceleration, support in Africa as an example of developing countries. Emerging economy countries, of course, as well.
All of them. So I hope it's a bit more structured than earlier where we interacted. And please interrupt, ask any questions, say this doesn't make any sense, what are you talking about? Everything that I expect from all my presentations. So I just want to give you a bit of an overview of what we are doing. So this is domestic Europe. Right, so Monica, this would probably be in any place where roof tiles are made from clay, just to jump straight in. It's a startup, they're making this great, and they have a huge problem, they're German. And German engineers don't talk about what they do. So these guys, believe it or not, it's an absolute disaster if you look from an investor's perspective. They made 150 roofs and didn't tell anyone. Meanwhile, 150 prototypes. No startup in America would ever make 150 prototypes until they talk to the world about it. So these guys are somewhere in East Germany, you wouldn't even know the place. It's the highest EU subsidy levels, 40% if you invest there. So they picked a place that nobody knew for the subsidy, which is already kind of a weird decision making as a founder decision making. And then they built, also rather German, a very fantastic product. So from a clay tile that's market standard in Germany, right? It's as many of the European markets have clay tiles, but also you asked about development. Sri Lanka is a clay tile market, weirdly. So there's all the South Africa, the growing middle class in West Africa. They're looking at clay tiles for their rooftops. So is this, we spoke about offline, is this better than the Chinese panel that's much cheaper and state subsidized? No. Is it cheaper? No. But this is clearly, as you can tell, indistinguishable from any other roof. It doesn't add to the height. It can go in between what we talked earlier about in the US. The zoning law will not allow you to go higher. You cannot just put up another 10 feet or so of height to the building. It's not okay under zoning law. So when we do innovation, and that's probably the main part that I want to talk about on this slide, if we are within the existing value chains, that's the best innovation we can do. This is just a regular roofer guy. He doesn't need to talk to an electrician. It's not 1,000 volts as it's typical in the solar industry, it's 100. I heard that the US building code is going in that direction, so you're at some point no longer allowed to put 1,000 volts on your roof, which is dangerous. So again, the Germans thought about it and said we should do 100 volts so that the roofing guy can do it himself. Fantastic idea, great. Then they realized that the common Christmas tree problem, where one thing breaks and then the whole tree, and the family's crying. So this should also be averted. Right? So this one, I think there's always 2 linked. So 2 could break from hail, for example, or anything, and the rest of the roof would still work. So again, the big flaw, self-criticism, typical German problem. They keep working on making a fantastic product, even more fantastic, and nobody knows. And Elon Musk is holding press conferences about his, I think it's in Buffalo, upstate New York, his super cool roofs that nobody has ever seen. I think his friends have three or so. Three. These guys built 150 and nobody knows. So that's the common, it's probably even a European problem. We don't roll out, we don't scale, we don't talk about it, we're not proud of it. And I'm very proud of that team. And you can see multi-family homes. You could do that in districts where, inner city, urban areas. Because that roof is just, this one on the lower left is in Switzerland. You could see on the upper right how it's being built. So there's no electrician nowhere to be seen. It's the regular clay tile. It weighs the same. It's the same dimensions. And we thought it was a fantastic startup idea, one of the few that we have invested rather than built ourselves. It just came along and they were in trouble because they didn't speak about the innovation. How crazy is that? So I'm very happy with these guys. And now we need to build new sales channels. We need to talk to maybe some Eastern European countries about district heating. You know, all from the 50s, these long blocks of rental homes that are sometimes 100 meters long and have 10 or 12 walkways up. So that needs to be a retrofit issue. I think that's very close to the Commission, if they're still here, retrofitting these large urban areas with what we call building integrated photovoltaics. Very small startup, still 40 people, so we created these jobs, but we need to now make sure everybody knows about it. Switching topics entirely, another crazy team. So these guys figured out that district heating should be decarbonized. I spoke about it earlier. Here's a bit more, like you were asking Monica earlier, how would that look like? So that startup, again, started building a prototype on the upper left. In that prototype, the innovation is steel. Again, low tech, everybody knows steel. Beauty, you can scale very fast because nobody will ask you about rare earth or anything special. It's just bringing heat in from renewables, heating up that steel block like Grandma did with a little spiraling thing, and she heated up the water. So again, very low tech. This is already 0.5 megawatt hour, so that's for storage relatively big. This is just to show that steel gets hot. You could now argue again, and I'll tell you an anecdote in a moment. Why is that startup team not going faster? Because everybody knows steel. We don't need to think about how big could it be. Like, we have built steel for ages. So on the bottom, you see a contractual relationship. You can probably barely see. It's Vattenfall. They need to deliver to politics in Berlin what they call the Wärmewende, so the heat transition in Berlin. So Vattenfall is very interested to do that in the middle of Europe. But my dream, again, I think Monica and I spoke about it earlier, is to take this, which is now, if you look on the right-hand side, an existing, I think, 200 apartments behind. You see that's an existing infrastructure. It's the gas-fired basement, essentially, for these homes in the back in these apartments, social housing. Right? It's owned by the city. We will now retrofit that house. It's not going to be bigger. It's not going to be newly built. Just on the bottom, you see there a little bit in shade, some steel. And instead of burning coal or gas in that house, Vattenfall will now use renewable power from Berlin's surroundings, called the state of Brandenburg, and heat up that steel in the wintertime. Just pour water on it and then make sure
the size of that is it a building, is it a container? That's sufficient to heat the entire big building.
It was even the existing one, right? And there was enough space in the corner to put something. So if some of you have worked on the research side, where some of the German scientists, economists, I don't want to name any names, Zinn has publicly said, we can't do the energy transition in Germany. There's not enough space for all these hydro-pumped water if you do the math. And then he shows very old white men, typically, this maps of Germany, how it would look like with all the pumped hydro plants. And it's not possible, and why are we not sticking to, I think, nuclear, whatever he's for? It's ridiculous. So the size of this storage system, you're asking this question. If you know pumped hydro is often like 1 gigawatt hour storage, so it could suck in 1 hour of a huge nuclear plant. Quiz, how big would a steel block be to suck in 1 gigawatt, like an entire nuclear power plant for 1 hour? Pumped hydro, we know, up, down, huge lakes, people swim in it. How big would the steel block be that takes the exact same 1 hour of nuclear power? Any guesses? Football field? It's even less than that. It's like a triple field, like from high school. It's like a high school gym. It's like 70 meters, 35 meters, a bit of a basement, a bit of a roof. So it's a similar It's close, right? Very good.
And on top of that is urban farming, right?
You could do anything. That's the thing. So from a policy perspective, within these urban areas, to have these innovations that are not really innovations, that can't explode. You could even take school classes and have these educational programs that we worked on with the Commission way back, where it becomes palpable, right? So that's the cool part. How much time do you have left?
Not much more. But
okay, yeah. So wrapping this up, my dream would be what KfW, the World Bank, is asking us to do. Can you scale this? How fast can you scale this? What if we needed for Lusaka, Zambia, a 2 million large town, a new system where we are not looking at old nuclear power, or like in Germany, the coal-fired power plants, where we don't have to repurpose infrastructure and think about the old system and the Russian gas and all these political issues. What would it cost to build this system with some solar in the middle of Zambia? And the answer is 6 cents, maybe 5, maybe 4, depends on how much heat you can use. So if you now go to a competitive landscape between international spaces, I'm paying, or you're paying in Freiburg, I don't know, 30 cents per kilowatt hour for my green power. Zambia would pay 6, 24/7, 100% renewable, no emissions. That's what I'm dreaming of. Like helping Vattenfall, fine. But if you look at the scale of new energy systems in developing markets, if that can be 100, including storage, 24/7 at 6 cents, you have to do it. That's what I want to go. Vattenfall, yeah, they're great.
We have heard from mayors so often who are really interested in the global south to get such things into their towns, that what they really lack is people who are able to deal with such technologies, even if they are rather basic. The maintenance is their problem.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
Very low maintenance, steel gets hot, everybody knows. So what you would do, if you worked in the old field of development finance, you would even do a higher skilled labor program alongside, right? Where you work with local universities. It's not taking much, just engineering. You need a few people that exchange very standard equipment, the heat exchanger inside. Steel is made in South Africa, for example, so that's no problem. And what you then maybe need is the last slide, maybe is somebody who then builds it and contracts it and runs it and operates it, but you would want to work that with a South African company or with a Brazilian company or somebody else. And so once this, you see here that's the answer that you saw on the bottom left. The dimensions are so small, you could add it literally to any industrial facility or any town in the global south. And then the question is, these jobs that you create from scratch, that's the fair and just transition we're all looking for. Right? You wouldn't want to bring it from Berlin. You wouldn't make it locally. Right? So that's maybe all we have time for, and I should take time from all of us just to show that it's possible, and the Germans are horrible at scale. And I hope we can provide
what we could do, rather than having a type of general debate afterwards, is to allow a few questions now, because we are quite at a point where your interest is there. Max, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, then you have asked for the micro? Yeah.
What does it weigh?
Oh, steel is extremely, extremely heavy, of course, and that's why it keeps 99% of it until tomorrow. You lose only 1% a day. Yeah. But think of any airport, like the Frankfurt airport is 80 centimeters concrete, that's fine. This is, I think, has 40 that I showed you in Berlin there. And it was plenty, it was way too much almost. So because it distributes across the area, so you don't have this pinpointing weight, that would be a problem. But since this stuff is just across, you're fine, right?
Can you bring the micro, please, to here?
So again, a question on technology for you, and this one in particular. So you said that this technology is for district heating, but what are the other end uses? And you mentioned Zambia, but do you think that Zambia buildings need heat?
So heat is just
to be heated.
Yeah. So in Africa, you would do cooling. Where there's heat, you can also do cooling. Just from a technology perspective, that's fine. It may not be the most efficient, right? Cooling from heating, but since this is an entire waste product, you just have it left, right? In Africa, what you would do, for example, in South Africa, you would do desalination with that heat. Okay. You may produce certain things. You may process agriculture. You heard earlier, right, with the urban farming. So drying agricultural products. In Africa, you would have to look at drying cocoa. You would dry tea. You have all these agricultural processings that often don't happen for lack of energy access in Africa. So all we are in Africa is producing. So going this downstream and produce more and package it even, you all need heat. It's all industrial heat. So the moment this plant, this little red steel block, and you see it here on the right-hand side, this is a power plant in eastern Germany that's heavily debated right now in Brandenburg. So this is how much space it would take, nothing, right? And they need, for their power plant process, they need heat, so that's another application. Okay. because it's a steam turbine that's running. If you can run the steam turbine on renewable steam, you have decarbonized the entire plant. So that would be what they call repurposing infrastructure in policy. Right? And the other use is, of course, agriculture, the upper left. That's in northern Germany. We'll build that very likely in next year. There's wind farms. The farmer is producing organic peas, little vegetables, and he needs to frost them, shock frost them after he's blanching. I think it's blanching, is that the verb? Where you drop it into very hot water for just a moment. So he needs both. He needs very, very hot, and then he needs very, very cold, and he needs the entire processing for his frozen vegetables in northern Germany. So he gets the extra renewables from wind. So the heat is all there, and if you can use it, it's the best. That's only 3 cents. So that's even better than the Zambian example. Where you lose in Zambia is you have to make it back into power. So you're losing on the efficiency grade of your steam turbine, and that's why you get to 6 cents maybe. But it's still a fifth of my German energy price. So I have to do it. Right?
Okay, sounds interesting.
More questions?
One more, no, 2 more. Short, please, because we want to have enough time for our other speakers as well.
I have a quick question about your solar tiles. We have very strict historic preservation regulations in New Orleans in certain part of the city. Are those in effect in some of the areas you're looking at, or because it seems like this would obviously be a huge advantage?
They have passed these zoning laws. So short answer is yes. There's German examples where the cities have looked at, and there's some German towns in Bavaria that have banned the big modules entirely, so it's not going to come in our town. So just so you know, these also come then in red. So it's a bit less efficient because there's less absorption of the sun. But if there's no other choice to decarbonize your town, of course you would go with the red one if the black one is a bit too much of an eyesore. Right? City of Heidelberg is another great example. I think the entire inner city is under protection landmark. You would do it there, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Question?
I'll try to be very, very fast.
That was a good one, yeah? Short and clear.
Yeah.
Very quick, what are the embedded carbon emissions in the steel battery? How long does it take to charge it, and how long can it store it?
Right. So embedded carbon, huge problem. Oh my God, it's so much. Yeah, absolutely. Clear answer, yes, the steel production in itself is a problem. Same as concrete. Right? Let's take that and say, oh my God, that's a problem. But this stuff is unlimited lifetime. So the accountants that look at it, they don't know how to deal with it because it's not depreciatable. It's still there, and it gets better by heating up and cooling down. Believe it or not, it's unbelievable. So from a structural perspective, it doesn't lose anything. So I would say live with it. We have these oversupplies, take it, and then make it into something that's basically there for 50, 60, 80, 100 years. It doesn't do anything but get better, but certainly not worse. If you look at all the other storage, concrete, salt, that degrades, it's horrible waste at some point. You can't really recycle it, you can't reuse it. So that's probably one of the huge advantages, is a regular material. And then the beauty of the technology is it can suck a lot of it in for 6 or 7 hours. Meteorologically, the usual wind patterns across the world is 6-7 hours, so you need to take a lot in these 7 hours, and then it sits on it. So the output is totally asymmetric from the input. Right? So that's the beauty as well. So a big Dow chemical plant could sit on it and just use 100 centigrades steam for the next few weeks. No problem. From like one big blow. Yeah.
Okay. I think we have now learned a lot about the technologies and about bringing these to other countries even. Prices, very impressive. Thank you. Good job. Irena, please come. I don't dare to pronounce your last name now.
Don't worry.
You are working for the company SYSTEMIQ, right?
Yes.
And that leads the energy platform and focuses on energy transition away from fossil fuel. Actually, that's what we are all about. Please explain.
This is the last. Well, you can stick. You can actually start from the last one.
Oh no, we can also start with the first one. No problem.
So this presentation was mainly sort of skewed on the macro side, but I think that it will be more interesting to actually start from what we actually do. So that's why I'm going to start from the last one. No, but it doesn't matter.
I can go to the last one.
So, so SYSTEMIQ is a company that has been around for about 3.5 years. And it's really a system change company. That's what we call ourselves. So we try to focus on 3 verticals: clean energy, circular economy, and natural solutions. And we then try to sort of attack the elephant from multiple directions. So typically you'll have the financial community that looks at the investment side, you have the policy makers, and then you have the corporates, and these three sort of constituencies don't really talk to each other, or they do, but they typically speak a very different language. And that's how it gets stuck, and things never move as fast as they should. So SYSTEMIQ sort of tackles these three issues. We run 5 think tanks internally, of which one, the most relevant to this, is the Energy Transitions Commission, where some of the slides come from. Then we have the consulting activity. The company was originally a spin-off from McKinsey. And we have the investment activity, where it's not dissimilar from what I understand econnext is. So we manage and sort of holding company based. It's not a fund either. So our family offices tend to be more US based rather than Europe based. And it's really sort of these big philanthropic families across the United States who really care a lot about climate and want to sort of create solutions on the ground, and we are their impact vehicle for that. So I run the investment side of SYSTEMIQ, where we really focus on 3 ways of channeling capital. The first one is work with startups. We don't just invest in them, but we actually second people to work with them, and we really try to scale and advance the technology faster. We've done this with software companies such as demand response, but we've also done this with nuclear fusion. We've also done this with hydrogen aviation, direct air capture, and all sorts of sort of technologies that we consider to be groundbreaking and will really, really move the needle. We accelerate new funds. We give them seed capital, and we help them to sort of get off the ground. Sometimes these are new teams, sometimes they're spin-off from existing funds, and they always sort of try and tackle a theme that is very close to what we do, where we have deep contact and deep networks to really help them then get to financial close and deployment faster. And the last one, the incubation is where we create our own companies because we see a particular gap. We look around, we try to find startups, funds, people that we could sort of help. We find no one, and then in those cases, we actually go and hire a team and spin off companies ourselves. And we're increasingly talking to established incubators to sort of take this model further and create programs which are specific to the themes we tackle, so we can hopefully access even higher levels of innovation. Right, now if we move on energy, so my background is energy, so I am through and through finance person because I spent my whole career in investment banking before moving to SYSTEMIQ 2 years ago. And I've always been in gas and power, so it's recent that I've taken over the investment area, which is sort of a big learning exercise. So these are the 3 verticals we tackle. In energy in particular, the last bit, our main focus is on the decarbonization of heavy industry and heavy transport. Some of you might have heard of Mission Possible, which is this big report that was published by the Energy Transition Commission, and they have this whole work stream within the New York climate this week, and it's having a lot of impact to the Energy Commission and various other Indian government, Chinese government. These are sort of the 3 hotspot areas. Hydrogen, we believe that of the 3 vectors for electrification, or decarbonization, which are hydrogen and its derivatives, carbon capture and biomass. We think that hydrogen has an enormous potential without being tainted by the others potentially, and we should really deploy it as fast as we can. Electrification and how the economy is going to most likely increase their electrification by 4 or 5 times compared to where we are now, which is one of the biggest challenges humanity has ever had in such a short period of time. And methane emissions from oil and gas. Why? Because gas is here to stay. Even the most bullish sort of green projections out to 2050 will show you that gas is there to stay. But the true CO2 sort of intensity of gas is often overlooked because it is very leaky. And sustainable finance is something that we sort of, that links all these 3. So one of the think tanks we run, which you might have come across before, is called the Blended Finance Task Force, which brings together all the multilaterals, but also mainly private investors to see how we can really start using this concessional capital to take first loss and then enable and leverage in private capital, so then the faster solutions can happen, and not in the usual world, which is multilaterals do their own thing and private investors do their own thing and then don't necessarily speak to each other. So we can now go back to the start if it's not too much trouble. And I think I'm going to take 5 minutes because otherwise we're going to run out of time. So the decarbonization of energy system by 2050, according to the Energy Transitions Commission, will require between $1 and $1.8 trillion. This is per year. This is equivalent to 1 to 2% of global GDP, according to the GDP levels of 2017. And people say, well, this is not material. Well, it kind of is material, because typically global GDP grows since the world has been growing on average about 3% a year. So if you shelve half of it because of it's a cost of decarbonization, then you go into sort of material territory. But technically it is possible, and financially it is possible, but it's not free. So the 4 strategies that all have to happen at the same time is efficiency, which we've talked about. It's power decarbonization, i.e. replace this massive challenge of replacing what we already have with renewables, knowing that power is at the same time going to grow by 4 to 5 times, right? So the world today generates about 27,000 terawatt hours of power. Even in the worst, sort of most sort of best energy efficiency cases out there, you'll get to 100,000 by mid-century. So we have to replace what we have with renewables and then build more, right? Even if you are as bullish as you can be, there is no way we can get there with wind and solar by themselves by 2050. We might get there by the end of the century, we certainly will, but we don't have time. So we have to push on all available cylinders out there as much as we can. This includes a form of nuclear, how much disputable that might be. That's why we're big believers into fusion, if we can get there. It includes carbon capture, all sorts of distributed power that you can get, and not one is the magic bullet that will get us on time. Electrification of easier to abate sectors, these are the buildings, the heating, the electrification of heating, the cars, and then the decarbonization of harder to abate sectors, which is actually the hardest of all. So if we have a look at what it means to decarbonize heavy industry, again, it's about reducing demand, energy efficiency, also technology, but it's really about these 4. You always come down to that. Electrify, biomass as fast as you can, carbon capture and hydrogen. At the same time, we are likely to see like a massive program of trees planting, right? We can already see big auto cars and big oil companies talking about offsetting their residual emissions with trees, which is great to an extent, but it can also be a great fig leaf to sort of continue doing, a bit like carbon storage, an excuse to keep doing what they've always done. So it's okay, but it has to be done. That's why civil society is very important, to keep vigilant on that. And I'm going to go very fast around those. But so this bit here is the best possible case with all energy efficiency scaling as much as you can, which shows you that by 2050 we could get to a world that consumes a lot less energy, but it's going to be mainly power-based. Right, so it's a complete revolution to what we have today. To be achieved in 30 years, it's something that historically has not really happened, so it will need a massive regulatory push. I'm going to go through this because it will take too much time to explain. This is, I guess, I'll leave it here. Actually, there's one more slide that I want to show you. This is the European base, is how much billions we have to spend in the next 30 years to get to decarbonization. And buildings comes back, right, is the top line. And as many subsidies as you throw to people today, they're just not going to go through the pain of, refurbishing their houses, knocking down walls and bringing in the new boilers. People don't want that type of pain. Then if you move to the buildings and commercial side, when you have these engineers that have been doing the same thing for 20 years, they're not incentivized to do things in a different way. And when you move to the industry side, even less so, right? So there is an element there where something is breaking between regulation and what is actually happening on the ground. And that's why since 2015, the situation has been getting worse, both in North America and in Europe. Power and hydrogen. Power is sort of a process that is on motion. Solar and wind are going to be at break-even in most parts of the world in some places they're already, in other parts they will in the next sort of 3 to 4 years. So that's in motion. Private capital has its way into it, and it's gone. Hydrogen is still very early, and it will require massive amounts of regulatory push and subsidies, some form of subsidization, or $100+ per ton carbon capture, which will solve magically lots of the world's problems, but there's no political will to that 100 magical number. Transport has the massive issue of infrastructure. Who is going to invest into the charging points and the various intermodal transportation spots that private capital cannot really invest in today, which cries out for green investment, green mobility banks type of experiments, which, you know, in the few places that have been experiments, such as UK, Scotland, and now 15 others around the world, are incredibly successful. And you know, it's sort of really difficult to understand why it is politically so hard for many countries to do that. But we should be doing. Every country should have like a huge green bank type of investment vehicles, because it's the only way to de-risk market failures and to solve problems that private capital just won't. And industry finally is the smallest of investment needed on the scale of things, but then industry is also a sector that has very thin margins, very often operates in particularly weak credit environments, and so it will need help too. We'll go through that too. And this is really, I'll finish here, this is in a way what SYSTEMIQ is about, so the company where I am is about. So you have to bring all these constituents together, and if you just focus on one of those, then system change won't happen, right? And climate change mitigation, to an extent, is all about system change, because otherwise you pull the blanket on one side and then, you know, the other side is going to fall short. And we have this sort of urgent need to make all these constituents to talk. On the finance side, we think that the model we have, and it sounds like you have too, there's not many vehicles that have this type of early innovation, scaling and fermentation to really make it happen. We should have way more of these vehicles. And considering the billions or possibly trillions of philanthropic or concessional capital sitting out there that has no clue what to do with it, all say that, you know, many of those will say they don't want to change the world, but then very few things happen, sometimes for lack of ideas or lack for people. The bridge to put these two constituents together, I think, is the biggest thing we can do to impact the mitigation of climate change. Because if you just hope for the governments to magically solve everything, and on the other hand, for the big sort of private investor capital to move the needle, and you know, nothing will happen. You need something to connect the two. I think that's...
Thank you very much.
Right.
Right, that allows us for a few questions. I would like to be the first one to ask you something. We have heard about communities. We know about the relevance of all the people, basically, on us and the lifestyle questions. Why are these only mentioned as buyers here? Where are the communities in their functions, which is not only buying something?
Well, you could argue this is a capitalist version of individual is a buyer and a consumer. The fact is that consumers, buyers, communities, whatever you want to show the power of the localized aspect, people need to understand the implication of their behavioral, but in particular consumer patterns, right? And I'm sure that if you gave people a chance, you know, a green steel car today would cost about 100 euros more than a normal car. That's nothing on the scale of things. People don't know. They cannot make informed choices because they don't know. Like a green iPhone would cost maybe $5 more than a regular iPhone, right? No one is making those choices because it's not explained. If you want to buy fossil gas, which is at low methane compared to Russian gas, which is very high methane, it's going to cost you maybe 5% more. So the fact that the consumer today is bombarded with this plastic thing, which has very little to do with climate change, and doesn't really have the opportunity to be educated in all these other ways that it starts from a personal side, is extremely important, right? Because you can typically, you know, we are raised in communities to say, well, if something is wrong in my life and if climate change is happening, it's the fault of the government and it's the fault of big corporates, without recognizing that very often, change starts personally, which is very hard, but it's completely missing from today's debate, right? So that's what that link is meant to say.
Okay, we can discuss, please.
Hi, hello, I really appreciated your presentation. Thank you so much. So I've been working in this field in the United States for a long time, and to your point about community versus a buyer, how you define people is, my experience, even coming from a liberal state, is there is not the same mentality and drive in the American public. And if I want people to make changes in their home, I need to make the economic case for them, and I need to make the comfort case for them. It's got to be a benefit to them. And I think we're in an urgent place where obviously we need to be pushing a little harder, but I really appreciate you connecting that dot in that it's not simple.
It is not, and the equitable transition is a massive problem, right? So yes, we can talk about fuel poverty and all these sort of very niche problems of society, but then the big problem is how do you make the transition equitable for the middle classes, right? So climate change doesn't become a privilege and something that only the rich can afford, but how, so it's about redistribution in the end of the day, as ever these things are. And recognizing that there will always be those left behind, right? You cannot solve everything perfectly, but it's about making certain choices possible for most of the people.
Good. One more question, possible? Looks as your presentation was logic and understood. Thank you, Irena. Give her an applause. And we come to our second but last speaker. Please, Dries Acke, is that right? Acke. You are from the European Climate Foundation, and I think some of you have been visiting the foundation yesterday. You are director for the Energy Systems Initiatives there, and I understand that one of your projects, flagship projects, was the Roadmap 2050, and you are dealing with the you interact with the European Commission's energy policies. So you have brought us a little presentation. Please present your work and your findings and your calls to us.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for inviting me for this wonderful event, despite the less wonderful weather outside I can see. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes and only 3 or 4 slides on actually talking a bit about renewables, and also knowing that some people in the room come from the US, maybe tell you a little bit about the plans of the European Union when it comes to renewables build out, but also talk a little bit about, it's not just about solar and wind, it is also about all these other technologies, storage, demand side, smart solutions, that are actually bringing us to some kind of a new energy world, which is becoming super economic and should become much more mainstream as it is now. So I think I can look at the slides. Maybe just to give you a bit of the basics. The European Union has just adopted the 2030 package, and there are some targets for renewables in there, which is 32%, but that's for renewable energy use in general. When you break that down to actually renewables in electricity, in power, then you get to much higher figures. Actually, what this slide shows, it's from a piece of work from Sandbach and Agora, is that already today the EU is at 32% renewables in electricity, but to get to the 2030 target, we're talking about moving that up to 57%. So 57% in 2030 of electricity in the European Union is meant to be renewable by 2030, in 11 years. Interestingly, most of that is also, it's not biomass and hydro anymore. Again, we had the benefit from having that in the past, but this is really primarily solar and wind. Yeah? So this is really the paradigm shift we're talking about. So we are planning to, the member states agreed to, basically double the investment rates and double the deployment rates of renewables in the next 11 years under current targets, knowing that there's also conversation already ongoing to actually increase some of the targets. So this is quite a daunting task and would represent a real revolution in the way our power systems work. I just want to show you, it's not impossible. It's actually quite interesting that a power system with so much renewables requires different flexibility. It's very intermittent, very variable, so it needs a system change response to that. And basically what you get to is, how can we create base loads with renewables? That is the new question that is the most important at this stage. And you can see that other technologies that we sometimes talk about, but not in the same way as we like to celebrate solar and wind cost reductions, and actually they are to be celebrated. In the UK last week, we had actually offshore wind completely subsidy-free at 47 pounds, I think, per megawatt hour. This is truly unbelievable. And actually it's great news for the US and other places in the world as well. The offshore wind industry is really maturing. But having said that, there's other technologies that can actually deal with the intermittency and the variability of renewables without being based on fossil fuels. I think it's an important question, because the previous speaker was also talking about gas, the role of gas. Like, what is what do we still see as needed as combustible fossil energy, thermal energy? And gas is here to stay. Well, maybe, but probably less volume than some people think. There's a lot of competition for flexibility in the power sector that is coming through with new technologies. And I'm taking the example from the UK. This is actually real world. These are projections from the UK government, where you can see that renewables are increasing. Fair enough. I wish they increased a bit quicker, but fair enough. This is an outlook for the next 3 years. You see coal really declining. I don't know how many people picked up on the fact that the UK is kind of coal-free for most of the time these days. But at the same time, you also see the projection from the base, from the UK government, that also this yellow line, the gas line, will actually reduce. So you go beyond coal, but you don't go into gas. What you get into is renewables baseload system, which is based on a combination of grid interconnections and storage technologies. Yeah. So this is actually, for once, I should say something quite weird, saying, is the UK on the right track? But it's this kind of future that we need to go for.
So does it mean that those who invest in gas in Europe are not on track?
Good question. My next slide. There's been a really good piece of research from the US group called the Rocky Mountains Institute. Yeah, I see some people nodding. Great. They've basically shown that some kind of what they call a clean energy portfolio, a CEP, or they also call it a WSS, wind solar storage. Yeah. So that this kind of new integrated renewable baseload systems are starting to really compete with gas plants, new, in a very short term. Crossover point is here, actually like today, but also even existing a little bit further into the 30s, so that the economics of a clean energy portfolio are really undercutting the economics of a new gas plant and even an existing gas plant. And this is with gas prices in the US that are for not such a great reason, but the reason is they're very cheap. Gas prices in Europe are much higher. So
is that the reason why they now export to Europe? They're fracking gas?
That is probably one of the reasons. They're fracking on quite a
lot. And the Europeans invest in harbors?
And there is a new policy since the Trump administration to look much more at exports than there was before, that's for sure. No, but this is quite interesting because I'm actually a little bit frustrated. We don't have the same study replicated for EU markets. Maybe we should talk about that. But the economics and the projections are nevertheless the same. So this is your new world. This should be something that policymakers start understanding, that the possibilities in the power sector are very different than even what they were 5 years ago. So to answer your question, gas is a bridge backwards is the title of that report. Yep, fair enough. So what are the obstacles? Because of course this good news show of economics and low prices is in sharp contrast with actually kind of deployment rates grinding to a halt in Europe. Investment rates in European renewables have actually stayed flatlined for the last 5 years, while we were celebrating the fact that the technology is mature now. So where does this contradiction come from? And then you can look at the actual obstacles. First of all, what I said before, we need to overcome the orthodox thinking that is really still very present with energy policymakers. We need to create trust in the visibility of the renewables base loads. This is the new normal. That's what I said before. But of course, there's other issues around deployments, and that comes back to a couple of things. First of all, people don't consider it theirs. They see an onshore wind turbine and I think it's ugly. I don't get anything out of it instead of just imagined or not imagined noise and shadow. People need to become shareholders in this energy transition. This is not a leftist idea of community energy. This is actually a way to move away from accepting the transition to actually taking part in the transition. And in Europe, we're really at that point. Europe is a densely populated area. It's different from the US and from other places. We cannot ignore the people in this deployment anymore. Same point, improve spatial planning policies and permitting. We all know what's happening in Germany. In Germany, there's not one onshore wind turbine that is built anymore because every project is in court for things related to spatial planning issues and land use conflicts. Why don't we just have a renewable energy atlas, what I call? Just look at the country, decide together with the infrastructure companies, with the NGOs, with the project developers, this is area for this is an area for that. Everybody can look at it and it would speed up the process. Of course, there's some other issues as well. Businesses can become a very important driver and investor in renewables. We know things like B2B contracts for big energy users actually covering their operations with renewables only. It's like a decision. Most of the time it's actually just logical because it's the cheapest way of supplying energy. PPAs is this kind of power pricing agreements that can really boom. So my question, I don't know whether there's businesses in the room, but it's like, why are just not all big energy users joining our E100, which is a group that has promised to source all of its energy from renewables? It's evident, yeah. Why not? It's even logical. And the fifth one is a more technical one around electricity markets. What we see now is that electricity markets are extremely important for anything like demand response, for anything like storage, what I said before. What we see is that there's a lot of good intentions on making electricity markets smarter, faster, more fit for renewables. But at the same time, we also see a wave of what I call badly designed capacity mechanisms. And if there's anything that we need in the electricity system today, it's creative destruction. Liberalism, yeah, is an eco warrior saying liberalism for you. And what we see is that these kind of capacity mechanisms are actually doing exactly the opposite. They're creating market barriers for entrants, from new entrants, new technologies, new business models. So I'm not here to say all capacity mechanisms are wrong and bad, but most of the ones that are out there proliferating in Europe and also proliferating outside of Europe, like in South Korea and maybe elsewhere, are just between me and you, just protecting incumbency and stopping competition in the market. So I'll keep it to this, and yeah, I'm happy to receive questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a wonderful addition to the presentations which you have heard so far. Please stay here. Yeah, please. I guess that you have some questions or additions. You want to know more about that or that? One and then two.
I can talk about it. I was curious, this ties into your fifth obstacle a little bit. Again, Tori Vanslyk from Uppsala University. And this ties into your fifth obstacle, and I was curious from your research how much you find the policy measures to be sort of conflicting. When I wrote my thesis on aviation biofuel in the EU, I looked at some supply side with land use scenarios and stuff and got some, half of it was kind of getting some figures, and then I looked at how they meet certain EU policy goals and targets. And just from my personal read and my analysis, when you look at some provisions in RED, Renewable Energy Directive, and some tied to the 2030 Climate Energy Framework and the 2050 goals, the EU seems to want to have their cake and eat it too in some ways. So I was just curious what you saw in that aspect, and I can think of one that, for example, when it comes to biomass, you know, there's a big movement historically in Europe. There's been a lot of use of, for example, palm oil that comes from unsustainable sources in Southeast Asia, and trying to move away from that, but then the EU says, well, we don't want to take any land that is devoted to food and feed. So we don't want to take any land that, and a lot of land in Europe and North America is used to grow biomass that would then feed to cows and pigs that we consume as meat. So they have that provision, but then they want to expand their biomass that's grown in Europe. So where do we get the land for the biomass? So I was just curious if you found anything like that in your research. Thanks.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I've been working on this clean energy package, which the Renewable Energy Directive was part of. And one can say that generally the intentions were good and that the result was incremental but positive. There's just one big red stain on that whole place, and that's Article 26 of the Renewable Energy on biomass. That has just been a very difficult conversation, because there is, different from biofuels, where there's been a lot of campaigning as well, I think, and also just civil society's role being very clearly a driver of putting that on the agenda, the negative impacts of that. You didn't have that yet on the biomass side. And that basically means that the European Union as such is now having a legal framework which incentivizes woody biomass for power and heat with nothing like a meaningful sustainability criteria or anything like that. So for us, it is one of the big unfinished, if not the biggest unfinished business of the European climate and energy package. It goes, of course, bigger. It's also a fundamental accounting flaw that goes up to the UNFCCC, basically, because an importing country, if you import biomass, you don't have to calculate your emissions at the point of combustion. It is meant to be taken into the baseline of the country of production. Yeah? I'm going to leave aside the fact that the US didn't even rectify the Paris Agreement, so you don't even cover it from that point of view. But even if you do, what's the checkings and balances on the fact that these emissions are actually captured somewhere? And why don't we just account biomass at the point of combustion like we do for coal and gas the same way? Yeah. So obviously, yeah, a major problem, and something that we are telling people to kind of raise the profile of that.
Is there anything more on biomass to comment or to add? Thanks, I think that was
there is something like sustainable biomass. It's not a complete no-go. It really isn't. There is something like biogas, so that's not the point, but it is not controlled in any way for the moment.
To biomass?
Yeah, related to that, making the connection to CCS.
It could give negative emissions. What's your thinking and position about that? In principle, it provides some perspective also in the long term. Now, here in Belgium and the Netherlands, we are developing CCS schemes in the harbors of Rotterdam and Antwerp to store it in old gas fields. If we would use biomass in these harbors, it would have negative emissions. So if there is sustainable biomass available, would that be the best place to use it?
Yep, so if you use sustainable biomass, where effect is that when you burn the biomass into your engine, the trees grow back fast enough. Yeah, we're talking about the climate depth, the timing is essential. Yeah? So the tree has to grow to the extent of the things that the CO2 that you burn within the next 30 years. Otherwise, you create a climate depth beyond 2050 when we have to be net zero. But it exists, yeah? It's just very, very much more limited than anybody expects. So, but obviously, what you say is true. If there is sustainable biomass and you CCS it, then you have negative emissions. Do we think it's a lot? And you can bet a lot of remaining emissions in industry, aviation, on the fact that you will do a lot of BECCS. That's probably, unfortunately, not something we can bet on. So I think if we think negative emissions, we need to think much more natural solutions. Restoring lands, restoring afforestation, peatlands, these kind of things, algae, seaweeds. That's where the bulk of your negative emissions will come from, and they will always be small. There is no such a thing as a negative emission pathway that doesn't need you to reduce emissions. Yeah.
Thank you. Irena, I think you were the next one.
Yeah. I just wanted to make a point.
Just wait a second, you get the microphone.
Yeah, the RMI study, which I saw too, there's an important assumption there, which is that those graphs work as long as you have close to perfect flexibility in a system, right? Demand response, all sorts of efficiency being sold back to the grid, which today doesn't exist, right? Even the UK, which is the most advanced of all markets, arguably globally, still far from reaching the type of flexibility sort of scale up that report assumes. So there is some sort of road to do. I think that is more of a sort of idealistic version of where we should be, but there is a bit of a baton then passed to the regulators to make sure they approve those flexibility reforms.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the reasons why RMI made a difference between the CEP portfolio and the WSS portfolio, the WSS being just like more simpler wind solar storage system and not based on the DSR flexibility element of that. But even in the WSS, you see that you do have this increased competition. Yeah. Of course, this is analytical, this is based on a methodology, you will always, but I think the trends are important to start talking about, especially as many countries move out of coal. We can move from coal to clean, and just imagine how much emissions we save with that. We actually had a conversation with some people from Sandbag. The European Commission now thinks of a 50% emission reduction target for 2030 instead of 40%, which is still official. We would, if the EU, the Commission models assume more coal to clean instead of coal to gas, you just get there. You just get there. That's all. So it's not trivial in terms of the impact that this has.
Someone told me a few days ago that around 1,000 coal power plants are planned or built in addition in emerging economies and developing countries. How can we relate that fact, I would say that problem, to these efforts in the European Union?
Yeah, absolutely. I think coal is still a problem. There's a lot of attention on that internationally for finance, but it continues to be a problem. And I think I don't know the figure myself, but if you say 1,000, that could be right.
How do you argue with those who now have to invest, change their mindsets, be more flexible, and so on? How do you argue with them? Which types of arguments do you use to make them act in view of such a development outside Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I would say coal is somehow a bit of an easy target because it's not not only a climate problem, it's just very dirty across the entire chain: mining, transports, air pollution, impact on communities. So compared with gas, you actually have an easier case to make. Having said that, we recognize, of course, that many developing countries are still in that stage of their development that they want quick and cheap energy. So it's not easy. And I think the just transition examples of here in Europe will be very important for the rest of the world. Yeah? And if Germany bails out all the big companies, Turkey and Vietnam and Indonesia are going to say we cannot afford a coal phase out. Look at Germany. So we have to be quite careful in the way we do it as well here in Europe, as an example.
More questions? Yeah, please. We still have, sorry, the lady there, and then you get the micro. Just to explain, we still have some little more minutes until our next speaker arrives, so that's why I just let you ask.
Okay, just very quickly, do you think that there is some competing interests between industrial agriculture and the goals of sort of moving away from biofuels and biomass in the US and the EU? Because the question is land use, all right, and who benefits as stakeholders? It's not going to be the small, medium-sized farmers who would be switching from food and feed to biomass. It would be the large industrial farms or food producers or agricultural interests. So I don't know if there's been any sort of view of this in terms of stakeholder chains or interest.
No, what you say is absolutely true. So there's certainly that interest, of course. If you go to countries like France and Italy, I'm zooming in a little bit, yeah, you do have this strong local farmer, and actually somehow, should I call it the hipster farming wave? I mean, there's a lot of young people going back into farming. They really are. And you improve the soil quality, you get, so that kind of, I don't want to call it a romantic idea because I think it's actually true. It's actually more present now than a couple of years ago. But what we see from the biofuels debate, if you move that to the biogas debate, which means that what happened in biofuels, you set the targets and you talk about sustainability later, and you actually never get to talk about it. Yeah? And then you set, then you reverse that policy, and you have a trade issue with Malaysia. Voila, that's a fuck up. Yeah? So if we do the same thing for biogas, which we're planning to do, cap injecting in the grids, and it will spur this kind of romantic rural economy, we're going to have the same issue if we don't do it carefully. And that kind of the risk of repeating the biofuels problem in Europe is actually really possible. So I would say, yeah, we're on it, and the trick will be to really carve that line between good practices and actually bad practices, and that's going to be really technical and difficult, but that's what we're up against. Yeah.
Thank you. Steve, it's your turn.
I was just going to make one point about your question and your response about coal being cheap and easy, or quick, I think you said. But I would point out that when examining the costs, you have to make sure that a rigorous examination is done, because costs aren't always allocated accurately, and they're not always captured in each one. So sometimes the general perception that, for example, one type of generation resource like coal, for example, is cheaper than everything else. Some cases that could be true, but there's other cases that I've seen where several of the costs that it should be attributed to the cost of generation aren't there, and so you get an indirect and inaccurate comparison.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sorry for I should correct it. South Africa is a good example. For example, you already have like
take the micro closer.
In South Africa, you already have solar investments that actually undercut running an existing coal plant, just purely on economics, and that then not even including all the external costs that are just not included. Coal mining in South Africa gets a lot of tax cuts for using water and all this kind of hidden subsidies. So yeah.
Still, but coal, there
Something
are some
more?
reserves. So the coal is
Just wait a second, you get the mic. We all want to hear what you are asking or commenting.
I agree with your comment with the cost, but I think the major problem of coal is that it is accessible. There is a reserve, and we can extract it easily. And it's stock. I mean, we can store and we can transport, and that's why it's easily accessible, and that's why the world is so consuming this kind of energy. That's the main problem of coal as well.
Yeah, I mean, Europe, we now have a carbon price, which starts to become, gets to more relevant levels, I would say. What you see in, because certainly when it talks to lignite is easy to mine, you just have to shovel it so that is, hard coal is a different story. That's more, let's say, operation, cost, expense, capex and opex. But even lignite is under pressure now. If you look at Greece, what's happening in Greece, in Romania and Bulgaria, lignite plants are really bleeding for the moment, and the operations of even the cheaper version of coal is because we have a carbon price of still relatively low levels. I mean, we're talking about 25 or something like that, but you already see that. So yes, I mean, it's just there, but a little carbon, so a little internalization of an externality already tips that over, so that is significant as well. But you don't have a carbon price in the rest of the world, of course. Yeah.
Good, thank you very much, Dries. We used our time well. And very recent and figures and very good arguments coming out of these. Please let me welcome our last speaker, Domenico Rossetti. Please join us here, Domenico. He's Deputy Head of Unit at the European Commission. Of course, the European Commission should have the last word. Hello, welcome. Please be here. And you are at DG Research and Innovation in the Directorate Clean Planet, right? When I was reading your CV, I was, of course, particularly interested in having seen that you were publishing a book, Mapping European Integrations Through Its Cities. I would like to read that book one day. You are invited to give us some closing remarks. We had a very intensive day, lots of information, 17 speakers. How do you now close that? I guess you will add some thoughts from your side. And I can tell you that a lot of, I would say, expectations and hopes are, of course, on the European Union and Commission. So, You can use your time to give the Europeans, the US Americans, and all people from other countries your messages. Please. You want to be here? Good.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure. After a good shower crossing Brussels, I got a very good shower. After 7 speakers, I think you also need a good shower. I will try to be very short. I have a speech which I will give to Max, that I thanks for the invitation. Just to tell you a few words. First of all, I'm just coming back from the Research and Innovation Days. There are almost 4,000 stakeholders, close to in the old Citroën garage, Canal Future Pompidou. Very big event, that's why I'm late and that it's difficult to conclude on the points that you made. Let me just focus on a couple of issues. First of all, more than 10 years ago, we produced a report called The World in 2025, Rising Asia and the Socio-Ecological Transition. I think the idea of socio-ecological transition 10 years ago was not very popular. Today it's completely common. If you look at the scientific papers on this issue, I think the idea of social and ecological transition is coming as a reality today. I'm very proud that the future president of the Commission, that the Germans know well, President-elect Ursula von der Leyen, made as a first priority. She's coming from, she's not a green by background, but her first priority is a Green Deal. Some of you may have seen that, but that's her first priority. The idea, she said, making Europe the world's first climate-neutral continent by 2050 is the greatest challenge and opportunity of our times. I think this is a very positive message. Let me say some challenges that we do not raise sufficiently often about the decarbonization strategy. I'm speaking for Europe. I don't know enough the US, although I will say a few words. In the decarbonization strategy for 2050, some of you may have seen this Clean Planet for All communication. There is, in very small, the characters are even smaller than in the rest of the communication. What is the increase of electricity? I suppose that you may guess that there is an increase of electricity production, but the increase goes from 35% to 150% additional capacity. I don't know if you see the challenge. That means you have to double, more than double, the production of electricity. This is a huge, huge challenge. Knowing that many parts of industry can be electrified, many parts of transport can be electrified, but these figures of additional electricity is very important. Obviously, we have to get by 2050, we have ambitious targets, 40% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. The president of the committee, the future president, would like to have even more ambitious. She would like to have already 55% of reduction of greenhouse gas emission by 2030. But this is something which is very important. What we are doing de facto, at the end, money counts. And in Europe, we expect that in the next MFF, apologize for the jargon, the MFF is the European budget. We expect in the next multi-annual financial framework to earmark 25% for climate-related policy. Is it enough or not? I don't know. I give the figures, but 25% of all the MFF, that means agriculture, structural funds, development aid, should take into account the climate challenge, which I think is quite positive. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that technologies are crucial, and sometimes the Americans are more enthusiastic than Europeans about new technologies. It's something that I noticed when I was at the Wilson Center in Washington some years ago, and the Americans more, maybe I generalized, but believe more in technological progress than Europeans. I think the Americans put innovation first, and the Europeans sometimes put precaution first. I think that a good marriage is very useful for getting more innovation in Europe and sometimes more precaution in the United States. But we need technology, but we need also changes in behaviors and lifestyles. When I had to make a presentation to my colleagues, I said, if I should be carbon neutral by 2050, I should sell my house, I should sell my car, and I cannot anymore go to see my family in Italy. This is really fundamental change for me. I have a very efficient heating system with the gas system, condensation system, then the most performant, it cost me 12,000 euro. Then everybody cannot afford this kind of system. I did it, but now my marginal cost of reduction is extremely, extremely high. And I think we should not forget that our lifestyles are connected, and we should make the good balance between our behavior, our habits, and our reality. I think that today we still are in the paradigm of proprietas, of ownership. People, it's my bicycle, it's my car, it's my home. And I like very much the usus. The Roman used to speak about proprietas and usus. How can we more rent, swap, share? I think there is a lot of potential, not by, in French we say nivellement par le bas, where we go without social security, but the idea of renting, swapping and sharing are certainly something for the future. I've seen both in Europe and in the US, there is a very strong place to individualism. Apologize if I'm a little bit beyond the classical role of a commission official, but I think that this anthropocentrism is getting, we are experiencing that on both sides of the Atlantic, and when the individual is the ultimate end, it opens the doors to intolerance, narrow-mindedness, and xenophobia. And the purely materialistic view of man provides a false happiness. This, you should think on this issue of individualism, which is very strong. I'm obviously not a fan of collectivization of goods and services, which are very often accompanied by an abolition of freedom, freedom of speech, but also freedom to act, freedom to be entrepreneur. Ladies and gentlemen, we need probably to have individualism compensated by social goals, profits, private profits compensated with common goods, the LTD by the non-profit and volunteer activities. With the corporate social responsibility and the emergence of social entrepreneur, this is a new function. When I was 16, 17 years old, nobody was being a social entrepreneur. Today, you go on Google and you make social entrepreneur and you find all the literature on social entrepreneur. I think it's something which our children should be proud of. Cities have a very important role. I remember when I met the first time Max was about post-carbon cities a long time ago in Berlin. And I think that we should act to get in Europe 500 smart cities and at least 50 zero-emission cities by 2030. These are among the goals of the European Commission, to get 500 smart cities and 50 zero-emission cities by 2030. Colleagues, again, it's maybe more philosophy, but I think that the man is the host, the guardian and the gardener of the earth. We need to listen to the young generation and educate the elite of tomorrow to be responsible of our common good. And often, we must let nature be the solution. But we should not be lazy. There are two acronyms that I listen often on both sides of the Atlantic, in Europe and in the United States, is the NIMBY and the banana. NIMBY, everybody knows it, not in my backyard, but banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And that's, I think, it's a problem of Europe, and I think also largely in the United States. There is nothing worse than a passive society. Passio in Latin means suffering, it's a disease. Then we should take care that the NIMBY and banana are probably against the idea of progress by intelligence, action and determination. We need to promote a better world with our strengths, our courage and our willingness. Ladies and gentlemen, zero-emission solutions exist, but are very costly. Just think to sectors like steel and cement, aviation and shipping, or in countries largely using coal. A socio-ecological transformation should be accompanied by a just and fair transition. And let's not forget about European and American autonomy, security of supply, and leadership in core technologies and resources. Dear colleagues, I like the slogan, better together. This slogan is certainly true for Europe, but also for the relation between Europe and the United States of America. The best investment in our future is in our young people, our researchers, our innovators, and our entrepreneurs. My hope is that EU and the US will continue to exchange, that was the title of the event, to exchange and to lead the world a more sustainable world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Domenico. I think you helped us to get a bigger view after all these presentations on particular issues, you are now giving us the big umbrella and the ethical backgrounds, which we also need to look at. Thank you very much. I think we are quite at the end of this event, and there's not much closing words or remarks from my side, but I want to express my thanks to the organizers, first of all, to the team, which was helping us so much, and to your patience, because 17 speakers on one day, this is a challenge. I was a little bit worried, but I must say the concept was wonderful. I very much like these interview styles and the short types of interactions, but it allowed that we learned about so many different approaches to our themes. So thank you very much for those who designed that one-day event, and I know that for many of you it is embedded to the study tour which had the days before and which have still more to come in the next days. Max, I think you would like to announce the reception now, or
you basically did it.
I can, okay. But I do not know. Is it there in that room over there?
Well, we can get there's beverages and food, and then we can bring it in here and mingle right in front of the table.
Okay. To repeat, so with the micro, you know the room with the good food. You can go there again. You get beverages and something to eat. We ask you to bring it back and to still stay here, because that's easier to talk and still to talk to those who have been here. I think a big applause and thank you to those who brought their materials, who were sitting there talking to us all day and enriching, let's say, our information through presentations and materials and bilateral talks. All right? Is that right, sir?
Yes.
Good. Let's now do a big applause at the end to all the speakers and those behind the scenery who helped us to make it happen.
Are you more interested in an art book or about Alexander von
I know it's starting companies, it looks like hydrotech companies from the very small startups who were something scale at adoption, just like California.
I'm sure it is.
Follow-up books that they're books that I used in tech when I moved to efficiency. Transformation, nonprofit. So we were looking at how do you change markets. I brought that using it. I think the theories came out, but it's for technology, but the theories came out from potato. That's what a lot of people don't know, is that someone did research on farmers adopting new strands of potatoes and realized the way they behave and so but he defines innovation as
We are opening a can.
You're in a very stable market.
We are opening a can of worms. I think that we should not go back.
Nobody knows. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we should.
Different innovations, different strategies, and different. And I think that the major thing this idea of talking when we have early budgets, people that are interested in that will say, I know it's more expensive, probably.
Yeah, you always need those people, early adopters.
But the chasm is to go from them to those managers that discusses market discusses the transition from what happened to us with MP3 players that we were building MP3 players.
I did that right away.
Yeah, me too. I was an early adopter.
CDs at my wife's, and then I said in the apartment, with all of this is new player and all that stuff.
But your wife probably would, and she was a
nerd. She loved it then.
Once you did all the work.
She's still
like you were saying, like if I'm building my house, I have to put a new panel. I have to think about, oh my God, can I get a quote from a solar panel installer? I don't know what I mean.
Right. We will struggle at the yes. Everybody knows you need it, and then how do you get them? Early adopters of that. How much is it spend?
Einfach so weit immer dabei sein, dass das was man.
That's what I've seen in, I've also worked in different types of companies.
Das ist eine ganz bestimmte Technik.
Fascinating with ideas, but when you go to scale, it's indicators. It's a completely different skill set, which an entrepreneur just says, somebody else do that. Next idea.
Which is problematic.
Ja, also wenn man so macht.
It's hard for the competition. It's fine.
Yeah.
It's rare the person making the
Ich bin ganz ehrlich.
It still might be. Yes. Taking it away from
yes.
And
yes. All psychology.
Should we get the conversation even more interesting?
Right. Let's see what kind of things.
Auch hier, das Essen, es ist ja nur eine Stunde aufgetischt. Ja?